And granted, for every opportunity that I was given in PWF, in XWA, in Northeast Wrestling, in any promotion, like especially at a younger age, I really feel like I did the best I could. And my true passion, which is obviously professional wrestling. Kenny King was just such a phenomenal person to work with. We were 4 kids that were trying to prove something. I just remember being in the back and just being absolutely pumped for this match. He was another guy that was just doing things that you hadn't seen. I was so thankful for him for doing that and just being his partner. I still to this day will never understand why he took such a liking to me. Some of my best matches with NECW was against John Walters, AJ Styles. I mean, that was just a dream come true. And I said, I'm sorry, you're gonna do what?
Ladies and gentlemen, hosted by Coach C, Chris Sanders, this is Best for Business.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the channel. Another episode of Best for Business. I'm absolutely pumped for this one. When I started Best for Business, this was a guy I didn't even know it was possible to get to pick your brain. But Jason Blade, man, thank you for joining me for this one.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris, for having me, man. I really appreciate it. It was flattering when you had reached out to me and and said, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast. And so I'm really looking forward to just talking with you and just kind of going down a little bit down memory lane. It's been a bit.
Yeah, I'm pumped for this one. So when I recorded with you before a few weeks ago, I'm gonna be posting episodes with guys like you, Julian Starr, the Logans. Like, this doesn't feel real to me, man.
Oh, that's amazing, Logans. I mean, all those guys, great guys. Yeah, it was great to be able to share the ring with all of them. Logan's. Yeah. I still think Logan's are probably top 5 tag teams in the area. I mean, they were just they were incredible, man. They were so unique, and they were just they were amazing guys to work with. In Chaotic and just other promotions that I worked with them and stuff. Really 2 really good dudes.
Nice.
Really good guys.
I'm pumped for this one. Now, I remember when I first started going to XWA, I'm going to tell you the story. I was afraid you was Se7en, but before XWA and all that, I'm curious. I don't think I've ever asked you, how did you get involved in wrestling?
So, so it's a funny story. So, I originally started in, it was actually my first match, believe it or not, was in 1999. Wow. So, I was actually with a buddy of mine, Dave Lambert, who started, independent wrestling with me. And he was very familiar with like the ECWs. And I was a WWE, WWF/WCW guy. That was the 2. I didn't really know much about ECW or independence for that matter. So he had reached out to me and says, hey, there's an independent show being run by NCW, which is JC Marks.
Yeah.
And they were running in Seekonk. And, he's like, let's go. Let's try to go early and maybe we can help set up the ring. And I'm like, yeah, sure. Let's do it. So we ended up going early there. I remember Matt Storm was in the ring and, we were trying to help out and stuff like that. And they're like, hey, do you guys want to get in the ring and kind of, work out? And we're like, absolutely.
Yeah.
To this point, I mean, obviously we were doing what every, kid in the 90s would do. That was backyard wrestling. And we thought, we knew how to wrestle. And, so we actually got in the ring and, we just started kind of just doing what we thought we knew what we were doing, and I remember JC Marks looking at us and he's like, hey, do you guys want to do a quick 3-minute match, no contest today? And wow. We looked at each other, we're like, absolutely. So we did that match. It was back in December of 1999. And then we did a couple of shows after that with NCW. And then starting in, I believe it was right around August, it might have been like maybe like June of 2000. I learned about Yankee Pro Wrestling.
Nice.
And Yankee Pro Wrestling was based out of New Bedford. They had a training facility there right behind the flea market. And I started training there for about 2 months, and then I actually had my first show with Yankee and South Coast Championship Wrestling in October of 2000.
Wow. So when you talk about NCW, how old were you at that time for that match?
So NCW, so I was at 90, so I was 16.
Wow.
I was 16 years old.
Nice.
And it was just, I'm so grateful for, for JC and, for everybody, down the line in the 25 years that, I've had the opportunity to wrestle, for every promoter who, gave me, the platform to do what I love.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm so grateful to those guys and stuff. And I see that they're still running. They were actually just in Bristol, I think it was last week, so it was pretty cool to see them still, doing their thing and stuff like that. But yeah, when I started wrestling, I was just about 15, 16 years old. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy. I met you when I was like 12 years old. So to do this at 20 years old doesn't feel real to me, man.
All right.
So when you said Yankee Pro, who was the trainer at the time? Was it Spike or not yet?
No, so it wasn't Spike yet. So the trainer at the time, and honestly, a lot of my training came through Brickhouse Baker.
Love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Brickhouse Baker, he just had a different approach for training, and I really liked it. It was drills. It was like the traditional what you see now, the internationals, the lockups, the tie-ups, whip off, shoulder tackle, that whole stuff. And I loved it. I love that energy. I love that way of training. I felt like it allowed you to kind of learn at a good pace, and it was just great. But I trained with him for a good majority of my training days was with Brickhouse Baker.
Nice. So one thing I'm curious, when you started off your career, do you start off as Blade, and where does the inspiration come for that one?
So Blade was always so yeah, when I first started, it was always Blade. It was just
Backyard
Blade.
too?
Backyard too.
Okay.
It was just Blade, and it never, it had nothing to do with the movie. A lot of people thought it can't, but I just thought Blade was such a cool name, and
Yes.
I always like kind of gravitated towards it when I was like, oh, what should I use for a wrestling name? It's like, oh, I'm going to use Blade, and so it was kind of like a spin-off almost of like Edge, like at
Okay. Yeah.
first, like the Edge character and stuff like that. So I started just as Blade, and I remember Joe Eugenio, who from Yankee Pro Wrestling, he wanted to change my name so bad. He's like, I don't like the Blade. I don't want to do that. And I came up, I was like, well, what about Awesome Allen? Like that was another name that came.
Yeah.
I was like, he's like, yeah, I don't like that either. Let's just stick to Blade. I was like,
Wow.
all right. And then yeah, and then I think he just kind of forgot about it. And he's like, we're just going to keep him as Blade, because I started doing show after show and they had already named me Blade. So let's just keep it at that.
Wow. So when I was doing a deep dive in your career, probably back in memory lane, I'm such a mark for you. So the first thing I want to ask you about wrestling, do you have any stories that stand out wrestling? Sun Dragon or Jonathan or Dango or whatever you want to call him?
Yeah, so Johnny Curtis. So he was actually one of the first people that I actually wrestled when I started with Yankee Pro Wrestling and SCCW. So he and I we did quite a bit together. The first, I would say, 6 to 8 months that we were that we were wrestling, because we were kind of always tied in together. One match that does stand out to me was I actually did a fundraiser at my then high school.
Nice.
And we did we were really excited about it. And here I am, I've got, a good amount of people there, family, friends are all there. So of course I want to go ahead and have, the match of the night and tear it up and have a good time. So, Johnny and I were going over the match, and there was a specific spot where I was going to do a 450, and then just have him move out of the way, and then we're going to do a couple things after that. Well, it just so happened when I did that 450, I knocked myself out.
Wow. How'd you land?
Sorry?
How'd you land, like, to knock yourself out?
So I over rotated and just literally took it right face plant.
Yeah.
But luckily, I mean, even for as young as we were, he was such a pro, and he could tell that I was, somewhat out of it. And I don't know what it was, Chris, but it was more or less just me being on autopilot, and we were able to finish the match and do it. We were still able to do the stuff that we called and the stuff that we wanted to do. But that's definitely one thing that, that I remember, about, one of the matches that we worked. But, he and I had so many good matches, between, it was me, and I think it was me, Mike Paiva wrestling him, and Kenn Doane is they were the talent exchange. So we had so many matches with those guys, and I've had some great matches with with him at singles matches and stuff. So I see he's still doing it, and he's at Chaotic doing his thing.
Yeah. So you to mention one name, Mike Paiva. So how did Emerald Fusion come to be?
So Emerald Fusion, it's funny. I think we were working, we did a lot. We were working with Yankee Pro.
Mhm.
And at that point, like we wanted to start branching off. Mike Paiva, myself, and and Mercedes was with us at the time,
Mhm.
and we just we wanted to kind of start working in other places other than just Yankee Pro Wrestling and SCCW.
Yes.
So we ended up getting a phone call from NCW. And and we were like, hey, let's do this tag team thing, and let's call ourselves Emerald Fusion, and that came straight off of the video game WWF Unforgiven. So I was looking at the move set, and one of the moves was Emerald Fusion,
Mhm.
and I was like, "Hey, what do you think of Emerald Fusion?" And
Wow.
so that's where the name Emerald Fusion came from. And Mike Pave and I, I had some of the best times with Mike. Just the
Nice.
traveling with Mercedes, Katie, and stuff like that. It was we had a real brotherhood as far as just supporting each other and going out having good matches with guys like the Talent Exchange, Kid Crazy. We had some good matches with him, and just the Kid Mikaze and Chris Camaro, just a ton of talent. We were all young. We didn't know what where this was going to lead, but we had so much fun with it.
Yeah. So you're one of my favorite wrestlers. Now I tell you, you've wrestled a who's who, you've been a where's where. Now I'm curious. One of the places I'm dying to know how your opportunity came. How did NWA Wildside come to be for you?
So it actually came through a couple of ways, actually. So we originally we were working with PWF,
Hmm.
and PWF actually was in contact with NWA Wildside. So they actually worked out a deal with NWA Wildside where they were actually going to have the PWF titles defended
Okay.
at NWA Wildside. So it was actually myself, Mercedes, Mike Paiva, and we all took one car, and then you had Johnny Curtis and Kenn Doane in the other car with Spencer and Matt, and all those guys ended up going down. So that's where that first came, and then the second opportunity with NWA Wildside actually came through Kenn Doane.
Nice.
So Ken and I actually had a match. It was I think it was in Plainfield, Connecticut. And I think something happened with Johnny Curtis. He couldn't make the show. Mike Paiva couldn't make the show. And, they were like, hey, well, we're just going to put you and Kenny in there one-on-one. And Kenny and I had a really fun match, a really good match. And after it, Ken looked at me and says, hey, I'm going to go to NWA Wildside. They want me to bring my own opponent. He's like, would you like to come with me? So I was like, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to go down to Wildside again. Um, Crazy story about this. So, yeah, Kenny can definitely vouch for this. So Kenny at the time I believe he's 16, maybe
Okay.
17. Okay. I'm 18, 19 years old at the time. And now we decide to get in a car and we're going to drive down to Georgia.
Hmm.
So we're driving down to Georgia, and about halfway through Maryland, yeah, I see, there's this trooper that's pulling up on the side of me, and then he's going on the side of Ken. I'm in the passenger side, Kenny's driving, and they end up throwing their lights on us, and they're like, hey, you guys aren't wearing your seatbelts. We're like, oh, okay, well, I was wearing my seatbelt. Kenny, they were just pulling us over, and so they start going through all the paperwork, and they're like, hey, well, what are you guys doing down here? We're trying to let them know, hey, we're going down to NWA Wildside, we're wrestlers, and so on and so forth. And they look at us and they're like, well, this car was rented in Massachusetts and it's not supposed to leave Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And I'm like, all right, so what exactly does that mean? Me and Kenny are looking at each other. They're like, well, what that means is we're going to drop you off at the nearest Greyhound bus, and then you guys are on your own.
Wow.
So, so here we are. So, Kenny and I remember we look at each other and we're like, okay, we could do one of two things. We could either jump on this Greyhound bus and take 24 hours to get down to Georgia, or we could turn right back around and we could fly back up to Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So we're like, screw it. Let's get on a Greyhound. So
Wow.
we ended up getting on a Greyhound for literally 24 hours. It took us to get there,
Hmm.
and took the Greyhound there, and then ended up having two matches at NWA Wildside.
Wow. So when you
Yeah.
talk about wrestling for NWA Wildside, I remember Julian Starr for him, he said it was the promos. But for you, is there anything that you made you think about like how NWA stood out compared to other places?
Um, For me, I was always so I was always intrigued by the talent.
Nice.
I was always intrigued by like what other people were doing. Now, for example, at that time I was so young and I was trying to expand my wings, so to speak, and to see guys that I look back and I'm like, wow, those guys were like AJ Styles
Yeah.
was on that show, and granted, he was still very young in his career, and just to see certain people that were on that show that I didn't realize, who they were at the time, but who they would become, everybody would know.
Yeah.
You know, so for me, it was the talent. It was watching. I remember, if I'm not mistaken, it was Altar Boy Luke, I believe.
Yeah.
And he just, I mean, the kid just could fly in that ring,
Hmm.
and just seeing some of the stuff that he was able to do, it just opened up my eyes to a completely different area of wrestling. And
Yeah.
they did it different. The promos obviously were they stood out as well. For somebody like me at 20 years old at the time, probably, or 19, whatever it was, like I couldn't speak a lick. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? So it was cool to listen to that aspect and kind of get a little bit of an idea. And Bill Barons was great, being down there and doing the car ride with him and Kenny and just kind of picking his brain a little bit. He didn't have to do that, and it was definitely very grateful for him, and taking the time just to kind of give these two kids that have this crazy dream and just giving them advice was pretty cool.
Nice. So one of the people you got to wrestle early on in your career. Now I'm just curious because I see where the location was. You don't see good wrestling down North Providence where I'm from, and you got to wrestle Jay Lethal at an early age. So is there anything that stood out about wrestling him?
Everything,
Yeah.
everything. Jay, man, talk about pushing me to another level.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Basically pulling out of me what I didn't even realize existed. You know what I mean? He was so just probably one of the most humbling, like laid back guys. Like would talk to you like he knew you all your life. And
Yeah.
all his life. And I just remember him coming back and being like, hey, what do you want to do? And I kind of told him some of the things I like to do, and he did the same. He's like, hey, what do you think of this? And just very 50-50. Like,
Nice.
what are you comfortable with? What do you want to do? And I just remember that match being very, very satisfied with the outcome of that match and how it turned out. And granted, for every opportunity that I was given in PWF, in XWA, in Northeast Wrestling, and in any promotion, like especially at a younger age, I really feel like I did the best I could,
Yeah.
and put on some really good matches that I was proud of at the time, and still to this day am very proud
Yeah. Well, all these years later, I'm still talking about him. So clearly, you made an impact.
of. Thank you.
I'm curious. Do you remember that first interaction you had with DC Dillinger?
Yes, I do. And honestly, with DC, man, like I don't know what I did to him where I was able to be fortunate enough to gain his friendship and his
Hmm.
respect. DC, man, he was real.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. And he loved the fact that I was coming into NECW and then turning heel with Sabotage.
Yeah.
That's when the first, because up until that point, I was nothing but a baby face.
Hmm.
So he really helped guide me and show me like, hey, like this is what you need to do, and this is how you need to act and stuff. And like I said, I mean, it was just he was just such a great guy. Like I said, I still to this day will never understand why he took such a liking to me, but I'm so grateful for it,
Yeah.
because he was just genuinely such a good person. Likes to joke and just have a good time, always meet you with a smile and a hug. And that's that's a name that I haven't talked about in years, and I thank you for bringing him up, because
Right.
I feel like he was a big part of the transition of Jason, of Blade the character. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And helping me understand like levels. There are levels to this.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And I think he just showed me like, okay, here's that next level, Blade. This is what's gonna, you're good now. This can get you to great. You know what I
Nice.
mean? So yeah, I'll forever be, grateful, just for his friendship, man. Like he was just, God, I could literally talk about, we, we had, our run with Sabotage, granted it was short, You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
there was so much in that small time frame that I can take out of it, which is just, it's amazing.
When you mention NECW, is there a match or moment that stands out from like your time there, or one of the matches that stand out?
Some of my best matches with NECW was against John Walters.
Nice.
I think John and I mean, he and I were probably married for, quite a bit, between the NECW and the PWF days.
Yeah.
Um, John and I feel there aren't many people that you have, I could probably name on one hand how many guys I had like that type of chemistry with, and John Walters is 100% one of them. I feel like he and I never had a bad match, and maybe he thinks differently. I don't know, but for me on my end, I just felt like we always had good matches. They were always we had a good feel for one another, what one another liked to do. I remember actually we were in Somerville at a show, and he and I were scheduled to go on. I think it was after an emission, and he and I are just screwing around. We're on golf cart, and we're on go karts racing, and play. So I remember they came running up to us and like, they're like, Blade Walters, you guys are on deck, and we're like, no, we're not. We're on after an emission. They're like, no, they changed this. They changed it. So we ended up just sitting there, like he and I are throwing on our gear. We're trying to call over the match real quick, and he's like, what do you want to do? What do you want to go over with? I'm like, let's just do the moonsault, and we literally called probably about a 20-minute match on the fly,
Nice.
which and there weren't many guys that I was capable of doing that with.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's probably about a handful of guys that at the time I was able to do that with. And John Walters, man, he was so easy with him.
Yeah. So when you talk about wrestling on the fly or just in general, what do you think are some of the biggest lessons you learned from Brickhouse Baker?
um so with Brickhouse, I think it was just it was timing of things,
Hmm.
understanding where to put things in a match, understanding, the psychology aspect of
Yeah.
it, and granted, I was very young at the time, and I didn't quite understand, but as I get older, it kind of now registers in what he was trying to say all those years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The old cliche of less is more. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? You hear that a lot in professional wrestling. That's something that he was saying when I was, 17, 18 years old. And I'm like, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But Brick, I loved his way of training. Like I said, it was you could have a class of 20 people and you worked.
Nice.
For those 3 hours you worked. It was just constant go, 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 go. Where sometimes, unfortunately, I've been in other training classes where you'll have 20 people or so, and then you're only getting in there maybe like a couple times. But it all varies. But we had a good crew down there, and he was great.
Yeah. So when I talk about your career and I ask you for certain things, there was one match that stood out. I was going to ask you, and you talk about it. What was it like wrestling Christopher Daniels?
So Chris was phenomenal, man.
Yeah.
It was so fun, and again, I'm so grateful for the guys over at PWF, and just actually entrusting me with such a marquee match,
Hmm.
because it was, they were one of the first companies that really pushed Blade and the Jason Blade character. When there was a big match, there was, when they were bringing in Jay Lethal, it was, let's put Jason Blade in there with him. We're going to
Nice.
bring in Christopher Daniels. Let's put Jason Blade in there with him, and, George Carroll too. I'll never forget it. When I walked through the curtain after that match, he was the first one to greet me there. And he said, just, you did it. You know what I mean? And it was just a sense of satisfaction, of just like, okay, you know what? I just hung with one of the best in the world,
Yeah.
and that was very uh satisfying to me, because in this profession you always have your doubts.
Yeah.
Can you do this? Can you hang with an AJ Styles? Can you hang with a Christopher Daniels? And honestly, at that time, I was still very young. I was this is going back, I believe it was 2005. So here I am. At that time, I'm roughly about 23, 24 years old. So to have that opportunity, and I just remember Chris too, first meeting him, very similar to Jay Lethal, but I guess these are the type of individuals you run into who are true professionals.
Yeah.
You know, he walked up to me and he shook my hand. He said, "Hey," you know, introduced himself and said, "What are some things you like to do?" You know, and we went about it. And we actually didn't plan a lot. A lot of it was just, I kept my ears open and I just listened.
Nice.
And granted, at the time, Chris, I was so nervous because I was like, "Oh my God, if I screw this up." And he's like, "You'll be fine." And to that point, and this is no disrespect to anybody that I stepped in the ring with prior to that, but I I found out firsthand what it was like to be in the ring with a true professional.
Nice.
Because he was somebody who just guided me, who told me what to do, told me where to be, made sure I knew where I was during the match and stuff like that. And it was just it was amazing to just see like the again the difference of somebody who had been doing this for years. And like he told me in the, you know, after the match, he says, you know, one of the biggest, you know, misconceptions in wrestling is you have to be working for the WWE, you have to be wrestling for one of the big marquees. But at that time, Chris wasn't. I mean, he was doing this full time and he was all over the place.
Wow,
but
yeah.
you know, so that kind of opened up my eyes too. I was like, wow, you know what? So I don't necessarily have to be successful and or you know, the you know, WWE isn't the only outlet, you know what I mean? So if you want to be successful, granted, you can do other things. You can wrestle for other promotions. You can go to Japan. You can go overseas. You can go to other, you know, different places and stuff. But, you know, I do remember Chris after the match, you know, thanking me. And he asked me, he says, you know, "Where else do you wrestle?" And I said, "Well," I said, I'm working, you know, I'm working for like a lot of places in the Northeast area. I said, "But actually, next week I'm going to be working for Ring of Honor." And actually I ran into Chris at Ring of Honor and, you know, the following week and stuff like that.
Nice. So when you say Ring of Honor, how did your opportunity for Ring of Honor start?
So my opportunity actually came through from a very, very close friend.
Nice.
So I, you know, I had the privilege of working and, you know, just calling Bobby Cruz a friend.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Bobby Cruz is amazing. I am so grateful, you know, for the friendship and the continued friendship that we have. He helped me out tremendously. You know, as far as when I say helped me, I mean just gave me the opportunity and
Nice.
said, "Hey, Alan, you know what? You know, I reached out to Gabe, or you know, I'm gonna, you know, I got your tryout match with Ring of Honor." And granted, it was up to me to actually, you know,
Capitalize.
capitalize
Yeah.
on it. Exactly. You know, so you know, that was the thing. I mean, sometimes you just need that door to be partially opened, you know, and then you could just kick it down, you
Yeah.
know. And you know, he, you know, Bobby, he was always you know, a fan of mine personally and, you know, just professionally. I mean, he you know, he took a liking to me, and I'm super glad he did, because he owed me nothing. You know
Nice.
what I mean? So I'm just so grateful that he took a liking to me, and you know, put me actually, you know, when he had the UWF, he put me in the match with Kid Mikaze and the Amazing Red,
Nice.
which that was, you know, that was really cool to be in the ring with those guys and stuff like that. But yeah, my opportunity with Ring of Honor actually first came through Bobby Cruz, because he was ring announcing there, and they were coming to New England, and Gabe asked him, "Hey, you know, are there any local guys that we could potentially use that you think we could take a look at?" And he's like, "I got one guy for you, Jason Blade." And I
Wow.
was there the following week.
Now, is that Survival of the Fittest 2005?
So the first it was the night that I wrestled
Andrews.
Davey Andrews. Yes. And
And
that,
you
so
got the win.
yeah, and I got the win, which I think shocked a lot of people.
Yeah.
It shocked me, to be honest with you. And the reason I say that is because Davey Andrews was like their prize pupil that was coming out of the school.
Okay.
So at least that's what I was hearing coming
Yeah.
in, was, you know, hey, this is the guy who just won, you know, you know, their school. He's like the number one student at the school. So it was a little intimidating. And then when I, you know, ended up finding, you know, that I was going over on it, it was pretty shocking. And I remember, you know, I can't say he had, you know, a problem with it. I just remember one time, and it was the first time it had ever happened to me. And I remember Jose Perez was sitting out in the crowd, and Davey Andrews actually put me on the top rope with my back facing him, and he just chopped the shit out of my back.
Wow. Yeah.
And I remember like it didn't piss me off, but it did piss off Jose Perez. He's like, how could you let him do that to you? But it was just I like to think, and I don't know this for certain. I think Chris may have played a part of that. Chris Daniels of maybe reaching out to Gabe and saying, "Hey, I had worked. I wrestled. This kid last week, and you got something here. If we
Nice.
work with him." So I don't know that for sure, but I do know when I did pop up and I saw Chris, at Ring of Honor, he came right up to me, big smile on his face. He's like, "So good you're here. So happy to see you." He's like, "Do you know what you're doing yet?" And then, I told him what I was doing. And then I did see him kind of go later on in like towards the direction of Gabe and stuff. So I like to think that might have been, a
Yeah.
conversation, but, just super, super grateful for those opportunities.
Now, do you remember that first interaction with Kid Mikaze?
I do. So Kid Mikaze, man, he was another guy that was just doing things that you hadn't seen.
Yeah.
He was I thought very comparable to the Amazing Red at the time, because when we were first coming up, it was the SATs, it was the Amazing Red. Those were the guys that were coming up that were getting all of the internet attention.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And when I wrestled Kid Mikaze, or first saw him for that matter wrestle, I was like, damn, this kid is good. And I
How
was
old
like,
is he at the time?
Mikaze, he and I are right around the same age. So this is probably going back 2003. So he's probably 18, 19.
Yeah, and doing those things at that time is like unheard of.
Yeah, and so I just remember being like, I got to get in the ring with this kid.
Nice.
I have to get in the ring with him. And unfortunately, the first time we got in the ring, he and I don't know what it was. It was just it didn't go as we had hoped. It was such a cluster
Yeah.
mess, like in a way. Like I think we were just trying to do too much, and,
Nice.
our chemistry wasn't there yet. It wasn't there yet, but I think it helped us, because he and I had never touched. He and I had never wrestled before, and I just remember, the anticipation of that match. Everybody wanted to see Blade versus Mikaze, and granted, maybe in the fans' eyes, it was a great match, but in our eyes, we were like, God, we could have done so much better. So it was a little bit of a letdown, but man, did we make up for it, years down the line when we, wrestled for the next, couple of years and stuff like that. He again was another guy that, I just had so much fun with it. And, he's a guy that, I can still pick up the phone and call and say hello and touch base and stuff like that. And, the relationship is still there, and he's I'm forever grateful for him, and and everything that he did for me throughout my career, and just putting on some good shows.
So when you talk about that first interaction 2 years later, when did the idea of teaming with them start?
So that actually came from Gabe.
Nice.
So what had happened was, again, we were down in Ring of Honor was coming up to, I believe it was like the Boston area. They were coming up to New England, and another name that Bobby Cruz had mentioned was Kid Mikaze. So they said, well, why don't we put them together? We'll put Blade and Mikaze, and we'll have them start, doing some shows and stuff like that, and have them wrestle. So we actually, if I'm not mistaken, the first first couple matches we wrestled with Ring of Honor was against Dunn and Marcos.
Love that. Wow.
Yeah. So, and that was some of the first matches that we had. And Mikaze was great, man, because he was just starting to get into making professional gear, like professional
Mhm.
wrestling gear. So he was just like, he'd be like, "Hey Blade, I got this idea, like, here's this layout of these tights that I want to do, and what do you think?" And and he would make them, and he'd be like, "All right, I got your size, here you go, give me the gear." I'm like, "Well, what do I owe you?" He's like, "Don't worry about it, it's fine." I'm like, "You can't like just make
Wow.
the gear." But it was really cool, man, and it was just it was so cool to be a part of what he now does for his career, and that's obviously making gear for
Yeah.
for the WWE guys and stuff like that. So it was I was so thankful for him for doing that, and just being his partner for I think our run with Ring of Honor was probably about it must have been like at least 6 months,
Yeah.
roughly right around that, if I'm not mistaken. We did a few matches with Ring of Honor.
Yeah, so when we talk Ring of Honor, there was one match in your career I wanted to ask you about. It was a fatal four-way for the number one contendership, Delirious, Pearce, and Colt Cabana. Does anything stand out about that one?
Yeah, I have no idea how I got into that
Yeah.
match.
Because that
but
was early on for you two in Ring of Honor.
it was, and maybe there was a call out. Maybe,
Okay.
granted, I had no business being in the ring with those talents,
Yeah.
but I was grateful for the opportunity. I do remember, working Adam Pearce and, working Delirious and stuff. And those guys were just such professionals.
Yeah.
They made me feel comfortable in an uncomfortable situation.
Nice.
Because at that time I was still young, and I don't know if you remember, but like, in Ring of Honor, the one thing you didn't want to do was screw up.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Was miss your cue, miss a move, do something, because the crowd would eat you alive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I just remember them taking care of me and just making sure that, everything that I did, was my strengths, and they really focused on that. And granted, I didn't have much in that match, which wasn't needed. You know what I mean? It was just, I showcased a couple things, and, I was grateful, to Gabe for having that opportunity, and for the guys that I shared the ring with that night.
Nice. So when we talk about wrestling, you've also teamed with quite a few people. How did the idea start for you to team with, what was his name? Sterling Keenan at the time?
So yes, so that was me and Corey Graves.
Yeah.
So that actually came about. So it was a show in New York, and Gabe, I think what was happening was I think Gabe wanted to try to find the right fit for me and a tag team partner. And I think he had gone the Kid Mikaze route, and then he was like, well, I got this kid Sterling Keenan, which was at the time I remember there was like some comparisons to CM Punk.
Yeah. Okay.
At the time, and I was like, oh, great. I was like, and you're gonna have me team with him? This is amazing. Like and I remember meeting him, and he was just a very cool dude, and we actually worked the Briscoe Brothers that night.
Nice.
And I love those guys to death. I love Jay and and Mark and stuff, and just we had a match there, and I just remember that crowd in New York being on fire. Yeah. It was crazy how loud they were. It was just, New York, man, was just a different crowd. It was always a different crowd. But I remember when those the Briscoes music hit, man, they were ready. They wanted to see some ass whooping, and me and Corey Graves were on the other side of that ass kicking, but it was fun, man. Like I can't say I ever had a bad match with the Briscoes. Corey and we only actually teamed up that one time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think our paths crossed a few other times at a couple of different shows and stuff like that. But I think it was, again, I think it was Gabe maybe trying to figure out, okay, where's the niche at? Where can I get, what can I put Blade with? Which eventually down the line, he figured out.
When do you go to Jason Blade from the transition of Blade?
So I transitioned to Jason Blade in my it was my PWF Northeast days.
Okay.
So I did change over to Jason Blade then, and it was more Kyle Storm and Matt Storm that were like, we got to put something in front of Blade. It can't just be Blade. And I was like, all right. I was like, well, let me think about it. So I actually went home that night, and I was actually watching the Born Supremacy.
Wow.
With Jason Bourne.
Yeah.
So it was funny when I was listening to, I was watching the movie, and it was like Jason Bourne. It sounded so natural. It just like rolled off the tongue. And I was like, Jason Bourne. I'm like, shoot, why don't I just use Jason Blade? You know what I mean? And that's where actually Jason Blade came from, was through the Born Supremacy, movies and stuff like that. So I went in, I think it was probably the following week, or when we had the Wrestling Academy over in East Providence, and I was like, hey, what do you guys think of Jason Blade? And they're like, let's do it.
Nice.
So that's actually where Jason Blade came from, and then I started using it right in my PWF days.
Wow. So you talk about wrestling the Briscoes, one of the best tag teams in Ring of Honor, but you also got to wrestle another top tag team in Ring of Honor. What was it like wrestling Steen and Generico?
So those guys were a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So another experiment that we had was me and Eddie Edwards teaming up in Ring of Honor, and that's where I actually teamed up with to face Kevin Owens, Kevin Steen at the time, and El Generico, Sami Zayn. And man, I just remember being in the back and just being absolutely pumped for this match, because so at the time it was Eddie Edwards and I had just came off of of a tag team win with Ring of Honor the week, I think it was like the week before.
Mm.
And so, we kind of had a little bit momentum and stuff, and now we're obviously working these two incredible athletes,
Yeah.
So I remember being there and I was like, man, I cannot wait to see Eddie Edwards get in this ring with Kevin Steen, because they are just two hard hitting dudes. And
Yeah.
you got, they both like the chop. They like both, they're the meat of the tag teams,
Yeah.
But I just remember that match being a lot of fun. And El Generico, man, dude, I just, both of them were just true professionals again, and just as far as giving, two guys who, were still, trying to build their names in Ring of Honor and in the New England, and just in the industry, the independent industry itself. They gave us probably more than they could have or should have. You know what I mean? So I was very grateful for that. And, I still remember like it was yesterday, making that hot tag to Eddie Edwards, and just watching him and Kevin Steen stand up to each other, just hard hitting, man. It was good stuff, and we had a couple of false finishes in there where I remember the crowd just biting, thinking that, we were actually going to go over, which probably would have caused a riot, but it was cool, man. It was fun. It was fun working with Eddie. I have so much, respect for Eddie. I actually just ran into him this past weekend. I hadn't seen him in years, so it was nice to catch up with him. I'm, glad he's doing well with him and Lish, and he's just such a good dude.
Nice. So during this time, I think you're still on the indies killing it too, right?
Yeah, so I'm basically right now at this point in my career, we're probably at like 2007, 2006, 2007. I'm still working Ring of Honor as a part-time, just mainly the New York, the New Jersey, the Massachusetts, like anywhere up in the East Coast. I'm usually getting that phone call. Pennsylvania, I'm usually getting that email from Gabe, and asking, hey, are you available for this day and stuff. And then I'm working a lot of other places. I think if I'm not mistaken, Northeast Wrestling, MXW, obviously Northeast Wrestling, XWA. I mean, I'm wrestling probably at that time. I'm wrestling close to 10 to 12 times a week.
Wow.
If not more. A month. Sorry, a month.
So what was it like wrestling Billy Kidman?
So that was at MXW.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
So that was at MXW, and I had some really, I had a lot of fun and some really good opponents at MXW, with Billy Kidman being one of them. And it was actually, it threw me by surprise. I actually didn't even know Billy Kidman was going to be there. And Joel Gertner, who, at the time took a really good liking to me. Again, don't know why, but I'm extremely appreciative of it. I think he just liked my attitude and, and what I, brought to the table. And, I always tried to be a true professional. I always tried to leave everything I could in that ring. You know what I mean? I wanted people to know that they were going to be getting the best version of Jason Blade every single day, day in and day out. And Joel just really took a liking to me, and put me in there with some incredible talent. Billy Kidman being the first of them. And I remember Billy coming in and he's like, hey man, I hear some really good things about you. I'm like, you do? I'm like, and again, because at the time, and I tried to stay like this throughout my entire career, is just stay extremely humble, and just and to have somebody like Billy Kidman come up to me and say, hey, I'm hearing some really good things about you. What do you want to do tonight? And I'm like, wait a minute, hold on a second, you're asking me, so I just remember having, it was probably about a good, 15-minute match that we had. And he had said something in the, when we were going over, and at first I'm like, is he joking? I'm not sure if he's being serious. And he says, Blade, I think it would be a great idea if we go outside the ring. He's like, I want you to set up 2 chairs, have them face each other, and I want you to body slam me through them. And I looked at him. I was like, Billy. I'm like, really? Because at this point, again, I don't want to hurt. I don't want to hurt anybody. I never want to hurt anybody. And I'm looking at him like, are you sure this is what you want to do? And and we did it. I did the spot with him. He had called it in the ring. He had called it out there. He's like, yeah, let's do the spot. I said, okay. So we ended up doing it. And again, for somebody like Billy Kidman to put the trust in me to know that I'm going to protect him and I'm going to make sure that, this gets done properly and I don't hurt him. I mean, that said a lot to me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It said a lot to me, and I was very grateful for that. And I remember after the match telling him that and saying, thank you so much for just putting your trust in me. He's like, man, he's like, I knew it as soon as you and I touched in the ring.
Nice.
Yeah, I could tell that, it was, that the match was going to be, good. And I think that's why he said before, I'll let you know out there about the spot. And I think he wanted to see how that match was progressing and how it was going in order if he was going to allow me to do such, a potentially dangerous spot to him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That could potentially hurt him, and so it was great that he gave me that trust in doing that.
Nice. So whose idea is it for you to team with Kenny King?
So that goes back to Gabe.
Okay.
So Gabe Skopowski. So I was doing Ring of Honor at the time.
Yep.
And he had me at this time. Now I wasn't doing any tag matches. I was doing just a bunch of singles matches. And I remember it was like a 4 corners matches. And I remember there was a really bad storm in Long Island, New York. And they were short on wrestlers. Guys were canceling, flights were getting canceled and stuff like that. And Bobby Cruz actually reached out to me and he says, hey, Alan, he's like, Gabe needs some workers, down in New York. He's like, do you think you can make it down there? And we're in the middle of a snowstorm.
Yeah.
And I was like, I will be there in 3.5 hours.
Nice.
And I got in my car. And at the time, my car, it was a rear wheel drive. So it was like a sled driving down there.
Yeah.
And I think, and again, I don't know for sure, but I think that's what gained the respect of Gabe.
Nice.
I think that he looked at me and like, wait a minute, here's a kid who literally just drove 3.5 hours in a blizzard to Long Island, New York to do this show. And again, I could be wrong by saying that, but I think he saw that and, he had booked me on that show. And then he had booked me for about 3 or 4 even after that. And then that's when I felt like the wheels were starting to turn. And he reached out to me by email and he says, Blade, we're looking to do something a little different with you. Are you available? And he told me the dates and he says, we're going to fly you down to FIP. And I said, I'm sorry, are you going to do what? And then this is like, I mean, I remember, pressing the send button saying, yes, I am available. And I just remember like, I was like a kid at Christmas. I was like, this is insane. I was like, they are actually going to fly me down to Florida and pay me to do what I love.
Yeah.
And I remember my father at the time, my father was always a supporter of me wrestling, but I remember he would get a little nervous. I was still a young kid and I was traveling all over the place, up and down the roads. And he, like any father, was nervous for his child. And I remember telling him, I was like, Dad, I just got booked in Florida. And he looked at me, he's like, you're not driving down to Florida. And I said, no, Dad, they're going to fly me down. And he's like, what do you mean they're going to fly you down, Alan? And my father was an Portuguese guy and stuff like that. So it was really cool. And so I remember, talking to my dad and telling him that I was actually going to be flying down there. So then comes the day of the show and, I end up flying down to Florida. And I remember Gabe actually picked me up. And now, Gabe is on the level, like just the highest of higher tiers, and again, I was a very quiet and humble kid. Like I would get nervous around important people, which Gabe obviously was somebody of importance. So I remember him telling me, and I was sitting in the back seat of the car and he says, Blade, we're going to try something different with you. And I said, all right, what are we going to do? He's like, I'm going to put you part of a group called YRR. And we're gonna start, trying to build a character with you, and we're gonna have you team up with Kenny King, Sal Renaro, and Jason Rance, and we're gonna see what happens. And that was the start of Jason Blade and the YRR in FIP.
Wow, is there any moments being a part of the YRR that stands out?
God, there are so many.
Yeah, you did a lot.
Yeah, there are so many. I mean, Kenny King was just such a phenomenal person to work with,
Mhm.
yeah, and to tag with and stuff. Same thing with Sal Renaro and Chase and Ranch and stuff. So one thing for me that really stands out was show number one was we were actually doing something with we were doing a big run in and kind of big schmaz and stuff like that. And I just remember like these dudes are a lot bigger than me.
Yeah.
And I'm in Florida, I'm in a territory that I've never wrestled in before. Like these dudes gonna beat my ass.
Yeah.
And I remember when we first touched and and they ended up we kind of went back and forth a little bit. It was just it was so smooth, and I
Yeah.
was like, oh, okay. I was like, this is good. I'm working with like professionals, and this could be good. you know so yeah, I mean there's a lot of good. I mean, just working, there's so many guys that I had the opportunity of working, like down there, from Austin Aries to Roderick Strong to the Briscoes to Seth Rollins to obviously it was Tyler Black at the
Yeah.
time. Just so many Eric Stevens, just so many guys. There were so many guys down there that were just so cool to share the ring with.
Yeah. So you've done some pretty cool things. Another thing that stands out, what was it like challenging Samoa Joe for the TNA title?
So that was an experience.
Yeah.
I'll say it to this day. Samoa Joe was, he was probably one of the most hard hitting people that I've ever been in the ring with. And I mean that genuinely. I don't mean, like, I mean to the extent where that man felt like a brick wall.
Mhm.
Like he was just so just built like a house. I
Yeah.
remember I had worked him, and the first spot we had done was a shoulder tackle, and I was like, holy crap, this man is just solid.
Yeah.
And I remember meeting him prior to to us going out there and working. He again was somebody who had heard of me, which
Mhm.
again, I was very humbled by that. And he's like, yeah, he found out he was working me that night. He's like, oh, that's great. I like Jason and I like Blade. So I remember him coming up to me, and he says, hey man, so what are some things you like to do?
Wow. Another
And
one.
yeah, exactly. Like, what are some things you like to do? And this is crazy because I've always had that, like, again, when you're dealing with professionals, and now you'll understand like his mind and what he was doing. So I basically told him, these are the things that I like to do, these are the things that I'm comfortable with, and these are the things that I think I can do with you that will make sense. And I did look at a lot of AJ Styles versus Samoa Joe because I wanted to kind of go in that route. So I was
Yeah.
trying to like look at some of the stuff that those guys did together. And I remember telling him, and he's like, he looked at me, he's like, all right, give me a second. And then he walked away for about 30 minutes and, sat down. I remember passing by him a couple times. He was just laying down, kind of processing the match. He came back to me and he's like, all right, this is what I got. What do you think? And I was like, I love it. Let's do it. You
Nice.
know, and we went out there, and again, such a true professional.
Mhm.
As far as, just he made it so seamless out there where you didn't have to overthink. You didn't have to get caught up in the moment. You know what I mean? He was able to calm the nerves and make sure that, we needed to, we were going to get to where we needed to be.
Nice.
You know what I mean? And I do remember his kicks were probably some of the hardest kicks I've ever received in my life.
Yeah.
And again, it's just it was the style of how he worked. And like I wasn't hurt. He didn't hurt me. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? But he let you know, and he let the crowd know he was hitting you. You
Nice.
know what I mean? And you want that.
Oh
You know
yeah.
what I mean? And I took it. And I loved it. I was like, do it again. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Because it just you're just your adrenaline is just running, and
Mhm.
you can hear like just the smack of his foot hitting my chest and the crowd's reaction, and then him doing it again. It was really great, and it was great to share the ring with him. That was actually the only time in my career that I did share the ring with him, so
Mhm.
I'm extremely grateful for it, and just the opportunity to have that happen.
Yeah. So when you hear Cage of Pain, what stands out for you?
So that was that was probably the craziest match of my life.
Okay.
So that was something that I think Sal Renaro, Kenny King, and Jason Rance, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into.
Yeah.
I think we were going into our opponent's elements,
Mm-hmm.
where this is where they excelled.
Yeah.
And we were just, four kids that were, doing this gimmick that we're trying to get over as, some of the top heels in FIP. And I just remember it being an absolute bloodbath.
Yeah.
I remember Sal Renaro's back was absolutely mangled, from just light bulb after just, I ended up taking a light bulb to the back, which actually sliced my arm, and just like it was the only time really that like I bled profusely in a match.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, it wasn't done on purpose. It was accidentally done. And I just remember, going through that match, and again, we were all safe. Nobody got injured in that match, but
Yeah.
I do remember just the crowd and the reactions, and I ended up basically going off the top of the cage through a table, and that was basically the end of Jason Blade for that match. And it was just it was, as crazy as sounds, it was just, I feel like it was the YRR here
Yeah.
type thing. I felt like that's when we made, that's where I think we made our impact was,
Yeah.
okay, look, we can wrestle, but we could get down with, with some of the top freaking, hardcore wrestlers that you have in here. And I remember, and I will never forget it. We walked into the back. It was me, Sal, Chasen, and Kenny King. And the look on Gabe's face, I will never forget it. He had complete horror. Like,
Wow.
what the hell did I just like do? And why, like, because I don't think he even expected us to go to the elements that we did. I mean, because look, we were four kids that were trying to prove something to Gabe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
At the end of the day, that's what it was all about. We were willing to put our bodies on the line. We were willing to give the fans something to remember, and more importantly, give something to Gabe, so then that way he could say, you know what, I've got something in these four guys.
Yeah.
And honestly, it was just from there, like there was different levels to it, and we just kept going higher, and higher when it came to FIP.
Yeah. So Jason Blade is a legend in the Northeast. When we talk about Northeast, is there any Northeast matches that stands out for you?
There are so many that come to mind. Again, I think, some we've already kind of talked about is, obviously me, Christopher Daniels. Another one is anytime I really stepped foot into the ring with Tommaso Ciampa.
Yeah.
Tommaso to this day is still a very close friend of mine. I actually just spoke to him a couple days ago, just touching base, talking, about the Celtics and stuff like that, but he and I just had some amazing chemistry, and we worked with Top Rope Promotions. We wrestled, we wrestled in Chaotic. We worked at Northeast Wrestling. We worked at XWA. We did so many like matches, and it was just like he and I like just worked off one another.
Nice.
He was calling my stuff before I could even get it out of my mouth, and vice versa. You know what I mean? He was just such a professional. Like
Nice.
really, and I had, I would say I had some of my best matches with him. Some other matches that stand out, obviously is AJ Styles. I mean, that was just a dream come true. There's John Walters we talked about, Xavier.
Yeah.
Love Xavier. I first wrestled Xavier in MXW in I think we were in Connecticut at the time, and this was for Joe Gertner. And I remember, Xavier didn't know who I was, and and I knew who Xavier was because I was a big fan of his, and I watched a lot of his stuff with him and Loki.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first, reached out to him and talked to him, and I was like, "Hey man, I'm a big fan of you, and I've watched a lot of your stuff with Low Key," and I think he, I remember, Joel going over the match and saying, "Okay, look, we're gonna have, Blade's gonna go over and stuff like that," and X made me work for it.
Nice. Yeah.
that he made me work for. He's like, you know what, this kid's gonna go over. I'm gonna make him work.
Nice.
And he did. And I hope to say that I gained his respect, which I think I can say confidently just because of the relationship that we built for so many years after that.
Nice.
And it was it was such an honor to share the ring with him, because I feel like of a lot of the guys I worked, I felt like he would always push me the most to do something different. And MXW is where it started, and then Northeast Wrestling. He and I wrestled pretty much on a monthly basis for Mike O'Brien, Michael Lombardi at the time, and
Yeah.
and Mike would honestly always look at us and say, "All right, guys, we need something hot. We need you guys to wake this crowd up, or whatever it may be." And he and I literally went toe to toe every single month and just tore the house down, or at least tried to.
Nice. I never asked you, like, for your entrance to your moveset, what was the inspiration for Jason Blade, you think? Who are some of the guys that, like, I don't want to say you shaped after, but, like, inspired you a little bit?
So I always try to, as funny as it is, a lot of people always thought, like, Jason Blade was a high flyer slash, I was this aerial, like, superstar. I wasn't really that flexible. I wasn't
Mhm.
really that, like, I could do your moonsaults, I could do 450s and stuff like that, but I really just wanted to be like, as I got older, I wanted to be more of an all around. Like, if you wanted me to grapple, I could grapple. If you wanted me to be a mat technician, I could be a technician.
Mhm.
If you wanted me to do the high flying stuff, the lucha libre, I could do that too. So it was really just adapting to the environment and what was
Nice.
needed of Jason Blake for that day. Like, I wanted to be able to say, like, I could step in the ring with the Samoa Joe and tear it up. I could step in the ring with the Brian Malones. I could step in the ring with whoever it is, a Kid Mikaze to a Brian Malones. It didn't matter who it was. We could adjust and adapt to each other's strengths.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we could put on a hell of a match. So that was always my idea as far as like what I wanted, the vision of Jason Blake to be, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, so I remember my second ever XWA. Vinny Marseglia is in the ring. He cuts his promo, and all of a sudden the door's shut, the window's shut. All the students, I think, in hoods surround the ring, and out comes Se7en. So, what was the inspiration? And during this time, like, are you starting to like slow down with wrestling, or like, what is the case for you at that time?
Yeah, so at that time, I was definitely slowing down a little bit, and I think honestly, it was a little bit of just burnt out, and just trying to focus on my career, like
Nice.
obviously my real life career.
Yeah.
So it was more or less focusing on that. I was doing really well with this, so I was trying to. It was becoming a little bit difficult to do both because my real job was becoming so demanding.
Okay.
Um, so the Se7en character, I mean, I cannot take credit for that. That is all Mike Antonucci. I
Wow.
mean, Mike Antonucci, like, listen, he has such a vision, and he
Mhm.
has such a love for professional wrestling, and his promotion XWA for all them years. It was his crazy ideas, his crazy thoughts of the Se7en character. So I remember coming up with the Se7en character name, and I said,
Okay.
because we were trying to think of a name for it. I said, well, what about Se7en? And I had passed by a bakery called Seven Stars Bakery. I was
Okay.
like, well, what about Se7en? And it just so happened that Se7en was the time length of how many years where it was supposed to be AJ Styles versus Jason Blade at an XWA show 7 years prior, but AJ was hurt, so I wrestled Austin Aries instead.
Yeah.
So then it worked out pretty well. I was like, holy crap, like that's like it just it writes itself.
Yeah.
You got 7 years ago we were supposed to wrestle, and now
Wow.
why don't we bring him in, and we'll name this stalker Se7en.
Yeah.
Um so yeah, man, the vignettes
I
and
was gonna say, like, how is this pitched to you?
so God, the Mike's crazy ways. And
Yeah.
so he said to me, he's like, he came up to me, he says, Alan, like, yeah, I finally want to do you against AJ. And I was like, all right, well, what do you got in mind? He's like, well, I kind of want it to come back, like, I kind of want it to be like a stalking gimmick, and like, we're not going to reveal him right away, and then we want it to be a surprise and some type of and then we're going to do like a big reveal. So we started thinking about some vignettes and things that we can do. And, we did a thing at my home at the time where, he was actually like, look, there was a camera like looking into my house, and I was, enjoying dinner with my family. And
Huh.
it was just, stalking, and the whole thing, which is said in the in the vignette when AJ finally reveals himself, is he's coming. He wants the Jason Blade of 7 years ago. He doesn't want the
Wow.
Jason Blade now. He wants he because at that time, like, is when I started slowing down.
Hmm.
So it's like now it was like, I've been doing this because I've been trying to get into your head. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want the Jason Blade that I'm looking at right now. I want the Jason Blade from 7 years ago. I want that guy to step into the ring with me. So, and it was such a great story. And there was just so many turns and twists to it.
Yeah.
With people thinking it was Mike Antonucci, who was the Se7en character. And then like the big unveil that it wasn't him. And I remember laying in the ring, the night that we unveiled that it was AJ Styles, and that place absolutely erupted.
Wow.
It was the honestly, the room was the floor was shaking, and just everybody that was there. Yeah, there was probably close to like 300 people were just chanting AJ Styles.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that's where the seven whole angle came from. It was honestly, it was from the mind of Mike. I cannot take credit for that. The vignettes, that was all Mike.
Mm.
And he loved that part of it. He loved that theatrical like part of it, and really doing something different.
Yeah. Does Se7en attack Vinny Marseglia? Is this like year later on?
Uh, so that is so yes, so that
Okay.
is later on when
Yeah.
I actually reveal myself as
Okay.
seven.
Yeah.
Correct. Yep.
Ah.
So that was so then that was god, this must have been about probably 2018, 2019,
Yeah.
where Vinny and I actually ended up doing like a little a little angle where I ended up coming out as the Se7en character, and doing to Vinny Marcelli what AJ Styles did to me.
Wow. So when
Yes.
we think New England, I think tournaments. There's not many, but one stands out. So I believe it was 2008. You win the Kowalski Cup. So how does that feel?
Man, so that is such an honor,
Yeah.
because I have just so much respect for Killer Kowalski, and what he means to New England wrestling.
Yeah.
And just I had the privilege of working with Killer Kowalski on a couple occasions, not as many as I would like,
Mhm.
but I do remember him being probably one of the most intimidating men I've ever met in my life.
Mhm.
I remember him, he was kind of doing a drill, and at that time he was a little bit older. He couldn't really move as well as he would like to, but I remember him taking his thumb, which was like probably the size of my entire hand, and he had put it on my shin, and he had put his hand behind my ankle, and then just with his thumb he had pushed down on my shin and literally dropped me to the floor.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, that's how, like, it was just and obviously it was the pressure points that he was trying to to show us. And I just remember working with him and just listening to him, because when you have that type of presence, you just keep your mouth shut and you open your ears and you listen to every single word that he has to say.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thank Chaotic for the opportunity to allow me to to take part of such an amazing seminar, and being able to work with Killer Kowalski. And yeah, it's just yeah, it was but so going back to the Killer Kowalski tournament, so that was held by Top Rope Promotions in 2008. And I remember being told, like, by Steve Ricard at the time, like, hey, we're gonna have you go the length, and you're gonna have 3 different matches tonight. And I just remember working those guys. And if I'm not mistaken, guys, I'm trying to think now. I believe it was BK Jordan, Mike Bennett, and Vinny Marcellia.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. So I mean, those 3 guys right there in one night, like, it
Yeah.
was just it was amazing, and it was but I believe those are the 3 guys that I wrestled that night. And at that point there weren't many times that I have done, like, 3 matches back to back to back,
Yeah.
so it was really cool. I mean, because I was in the ring with, some great professionals and guys that could, that could work. And, I remember us just going in there and doing it. And, yeah, and luckily, at the end of the night, I had my hand raised, and it was such a great honor. And I was actually able to, this past year when I came back from Florida, I was able to attend the Kowalski Cup, and Steve Ricard asked me, he's like, "Hey, would you mind bringing out the trophy to the winner?" And I did, and it was really cool. It was a nice, like, just
Full
full
circle moment.
circle. Yeah, absolutely.
So when we talk top rope now, I remember a while ago I reached out to you about this podcast and I was asking you about wrestling. All right, something happened and you told me to stay tuned. And not too long ago, you returned to Top Rope Promotions. So what is it about it? Do you have any goals nowadays? I think the first match was Cesar Leo, was it?
Yeah, it was, and look, I've it just, I feel like, I've done so much with my personal career, and building restaurants and stuff, and now that I have that kind of, I've built it, it's sustainable, it runs on its own. It's allowed me to to focus on my true passion, which is obviously professional wrestling. I've always loved professional wrestling, and I've always said to myself, like, I will continue to to do it until one, my body doesn't allow me to do it any longer, or until it's no longer fun.
Yeah.
And I think just being around the younger students, and and just watching them, and it's kind of relit a passion in me. And as far as, like, I don't feel like I have anything to prove. That's not why I'm doing it. I'm just doing it because I enjoy doing it.
Nice.
You know what I mean? I'm doing it because I can purely say that I love professional wrestling, and I get gratification by stepping in the ring with guys like Jorah, and guys like Caesar, and guys like just the newer students that are coming around and stuff like that, working at Top Rope Promotions, and just watching them excel, and watching them learn. And it's been really fun. So I've been working. I've had a few other promotions that have reached out to me that
Oh boy.
yeah, so I think, unfortunately, it's I shouldn't say unfortunate, but once word got around that I started doing a little bit more, but I'm trying to stay within reason as far as how many shows I do. Obviously,
Okay.
because of my career and stuff like that with wrestling, but sorry, with my job, but yeah, it's great to even be offered the opportunity to take part of certain shows, because there are so many amazing talents and so many professionally run shows in this area. For them to even reach out to me and say, "Hey, Blade, we'd like to have you a part of it," is super humbling, and I'm extremely grateful for it. So yeah, so I guess all I can say is you just you never know where I might pop up next.
Nice. So when you talk passion, I'm curious, when did your passion for collecting start? Because I remember the Major Pod Boys, they'd give you shout outs. You'd always be active in the group, raiding all the Walmarts and Targets. But when did your passion start for collecting?
Man, so I mean, as you can see behind me, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? It's so I've always been a kid at heart. You know what I mean? I am, like, I've always loved wrestling. Wrestling is in my blood. It is, and this takes me back to the greatest time of my life.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, and I loved playing playing with these action figures and stuff like that. And it brings back such an amazing time in my life. And so I've been collecting now probably for the better part of, I would say, 15 to 20 years.
Wow.
A lot of it, it's just the Hasbro's kind of came in time. Obviously I would buy a couple here and there and stuff like that, and now I have the complete set loose, the complete set mint on card. I've got an 80% complete LJN mint on card.
Wow.
Collection and stuff like that. Still working on the loose set. But I talk to the boys a lot, the Matt Cardona and Brian Myers and stuff. I talk to those guys, and we've had a pretty good relationship as far as just shooting the shit with
Right.
action figures and stuff like that. But yeah, it's funny story, but who actually introduced me to them and let them know about my collection was actually Kid Mikaze.
Wow, nice.
Yeah, so when Kid Mikaze was working with WWE and Matt Cardona was still there, he's like, "Yo, you guys got to see Jason Blade's collection." And then yeah, I remember Matt Cardona reaching out to me on Instagram, and he just DM'd me. He's like, "Man, your collection's it's crazy." And I actually just ran into Matt this past weekend, and he and I were kind of just talking for a little bit. And but yeah, I mean, it comes from the collection just comes from just a passion from just it kind of again lets me relive my childhood.
Yeah. Well, Jason Blade, I want to thank you for doing this. However, down the line, we're going to need a part 2. However, I've ended every interview the same though. The day you decide it's all done in pro wrestling, which I don't hope is anytime soon, but the day you decide it's all done in wrestling, what do you want Jason Blade's legacy in wrestling to be?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I want people to, when they look up Jason Blade matches or they look up, anything regarding Jason Blade, I want them to know and understand that, I put my heart into everything that I did.
Yeah.
And I absolutely loved every minute of it.
Mhm.
And to this day, I still love doing it. I am grateful for every fan. I am grateful for every promoter. I am grateful for every person who has shared the ring with me. I am, just thankful for everybody who has trusted me, to step in the ring with. And yeah, man, it's just that's it.
Yeah.
I just as far as the legacy, I mean, legacy. I mean, I don't know if I'm worthy of that word legacy, but I want people to just respect the name Jason Blade, and and know that when I was in there, like I just did the best I could.
Yeah, well, Jason Blade, I want to thank you for doing this. Like I said, I started watching you when I was like 12. So me being 20 years old to do this, man, it's full circle. So thank you, man, for everything.
No, thank you so much, because I appreciate you giving me the platform just to talk about my crazy life of pro wrestling, man. It's been an absolute honor, and I appreciate you just letting me go down, a memory lane, which I brought up a lot of stuff here.
There's still more. I think down the line we got to do a part 2 or something.
No, there is. And listen, anytime you want to do a part 2, give me a call. I will absolutely do a part 2. I mean, there's definitely more I'm sure we could touch on.
Thank you, Jason, for doing this. And thank you, everybody, for watching this episode. This was Best for Business.
Thank you for watching this episode of Best for Business. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, because this is Best for Business.